I've lived on the same piece of land in southern Mississippi for most of my life. 53 acres of low country that my grandfather bought back when gas was cheap and people still settled disputes with handshakes instead of lawyers. Most of it is dry enough to work, but down in the southeast corner there's a stretch of wetland that has always looked the same. Tall reeds swaying in the wind, shallow standing water reflecting the sky, frogs loud enough to keep you awake during summer nights. The kind of place developers see as wasted space and locals understand is doing a job. That wetland catches runoff every time we get one of our famous Gulf Coast downpours. And around here that matters because the water table sits so close to the surface that if you stare at the ground too hard it feels like it might flood. My family never tried to build on it, never tried to drain it, never tried to fight nature. We respected it because we understood it. Apparently, the people who bought the property next door didn't feel the same way. The trouble started after my old neighbor, Walter McKinney, passed away. Walter had owned the 60 acres south of me for decades. Quiet guy, good neighbor, the kind who waved from a tractor and minded his own business. When he died, his kids sold the property to a development company called Magnolia Ridge Ventures. They paid a few $100,000 for the land and immediately announced plans for an upscale subdivision called Cypress Landing. The brochures talked about luxury country living, preserving natural beauty, respecting the environment. You know, all the usual marketing language developers print right before they bulldoze everything in sight. Construction began that summer. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Trucks came and went, equipment moved around, survey stakes appeared. That happens whenever land changes hands. Then one morning I decided to walk my fence line after a heavy rain. It was something I'd done hundreds of times over the years. Halfway down the property line, I noticed something looked wrong. At first I couldn't figure out what it was. The horizon seemed different somehow. Then I climbed a small rise and saw it. My stomach dropped immediately. Sitting directly on top of my protected wetland was a giant mound of filled dirt. Not beside it. Not near it. Right on top of it. Acres of wetland were buried beneath thick layers of clay and construction fill. What had been shallow water and native vegetation only a week earlier now looked like a raised construction platform. I remember standing there in complete silence for several seconds because my brain honestly refused to process what I was seeing. Then I got angry. The kind of anger that starts cold before it gets hot. I walked straight toward the construction site and found the site superintendent, a guy named Travis Boone. He was reviewing plans from the tailgate of a pickup truck when I walked up carrying copies of my survey maps. "You got a problem," I told him. He looked annoyed before he even looked concerned. "What kind of problem?" he asked. I spread the survey across the truck bed and pointed directly at the property boundary. "Your crews just dumped filled dirt all over federally protected wetlands." "My wetlands." He stared at the map. Then he stared toward the dirt pile. Then he stared back at the map. I watched the color leave his face in real time. "Well, hell," he muttered. "Looks like the survey crew may have made a mistake." Now, if you've dealt with contractors before, you learn something important. When somebody says there may have been a mistake, that usually means there absolutely was a mistake, and they're already calculating how expensive it's about to become. I told him he needed to stop work immediately and call his bosses. He nodded without arguing, which honestly worried me more. People only get that cooperative when they know they're in serious trouble. By that afternoon, I received a call from the owner of Magnolia Ridge Ventures, a developer named Grant Holloway. His tone was friendly, almost cheerful. Too cheerful. "I hear we've got a little misunderstanding," he said. I laughed because the word misunderstanding was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. He explained that mistakes happen, surveys get crossed, lines get blurred. Then he made his first offer. "Why don't we just buy that corner from you?" he asked. "Fair market value. Everybody wins." That told me everything I needed to know. They weren't planning to fix anything. They were planning to make the problem disappear. I told him the land wasn't for sale. He immediately increased the offer, then increased it again. The numbers got larger, but my answer stayed the same. Finally, I told him exactly what needed to happen. Remove every ounce of dirt. Restore every acre of wetland. Return it to the condition it was in before his crews crossed the property line. The silence on the phone lasted several seconds. Then his voice changed completely. The friendliness vanished. The salesman disappeared. What remained was a man who wasn't used to hearing the word no. "You're making a mistake," he said. "No," I replied, staring out toward the buried marsh. Your company already made the mistake." He hung up without another word. Standing there beside that ruined wetland, looking across land my family had protected for generations, I had a feeling this fight was about to become much bigger than a pile of dirt. What I didn't know yet was that before it ended, federal regulators would get involved. A judge would issue an order nobody expected, and the people responsible would spend nearly $1 million digging up the very mess they created. Before I continue with what happened next, let me explain something, because this is where a lot of people get confused. Folks hear the word wetland and picture some useless patch of swamp nobody cares about, but that's not how the government sees it. According to standard procedure, once land is classified as protected wetland, moving soil in or out of that area can trigger a whole stack of federal regulations. From a legal perspective, it doesn't matter whether the damage happened because of greed, carelessness, or somebody reading the wrong survey map. The responsibility usually falls on the party that caused the disturbance. What made this situation even worse was the reaction afterward. Instead of fixing the problem immediately, the developer tried to buy his way out of it. This is a psychological trap a lot of powerful people fall into. When money solves most of your problems, you start believing money can solve all of them. The lesson here is that property rights and environmental regulations don't suddenly disappear because a project is expensive or because somebody is in a hurry. In fact, the moment someone tries to shortcut those rules, the costs usually become much bigger than the original mistake. The morning after my conversation with Grant Holloway, I started documenting everything. Every angle, every truck track, every section of buried marsh, every damaged patch of vegetation. I took photographs, recorded videos, marked GPS coordinates, and gathered old survey records that showed exactly where the wetland boundaries had existed long before Magnolia Ridge Ventures ever showed up. A lot of people think disputes like this are won with dramatic speeches and emotional arguments, but in reality, they're won with paperwork. Evidence beats outrage every single time. A week later, I filed formal complaints with federal and state environmental agencies and then settled in to wait. The waiting didn't last long. Within days, inspectors arrived. I watched them walk the site carrying equipment, maps, tablets, and soil probes. They moved slowly, carefully, professionally. Unlike developers, regulators tend not to rush. They collected samples from multiple locations, compared elevation changes, reviewed historical wetland maps, and took measurements that seemed endless. The construction crews stopped what they were doing and watched from a distance. You could almost feel the mood changing across the entire development site. The confidence was gone. The swagger had disappeared. Everyone knew something serious was happening. 2 weeks later, the findings came back. Every major concern had been confirmed. The fill material had been placed directly on protected wetland. No permit existed. No authorization had been issued. No legal approval had ever been granted. The agencies moved quickly after that. Construction activity across the entire subdivision was ordered to stop. Work crews were sent home. Equipment sat idle. Sales activity froze. What had been advertised as the area's newest luxury development suddenly became a very expensive parking lot. Grant called me that same evening. This time there was no fake friendliness. No smiling salesman voice. No attempt at charm. He sounded furious. "Do you have any idea what this shutdown is costing me every day?" he snapped. I remember sitting on my porch when the call came. The sun was setting over the tree line, and I could hear frogs beginning their evening chorus out in the marsh. "Probably less than it's going to cost you later," I said. The silence that followed told me he didn't appreciate the answer. Then came the threats. Lawsuits. Delays. Claims that I was intentionally interfering with business operations. It was all noise. The problem for Grant was simple. Facts are stubborn things. His company had crossed a property line and buried protected land. No amount of anger could change that. That's when I hired an environmental attorney named Renee Landry. Renee wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't one of those television lawyers who turns every sentence into a performance. She was calm, organized, and absolutely relentless. After reviewing the evidence, she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "This case isn't about whether they violated the law," she said. "They already did. This case is about how expensive the correction is going to be." That turned out to be exactly right. The federal case moved forward while Magnolia Ridge desperately searched for alternatives. Their consultants proposed mitigation plans. They suggested creating replacement wetlands elsewhere. They suggested partial restoration. They suggested financial settlements. They suggested engineering solutions that sounded impressive until experts examined them closely. Every proposal was rejected. The agencies wanted one thing, and one thing only: full restoration. Nothing less. Every time Magnolia Ridge tried presenting a shortcut, regulators pushed it aside. Every time they proposed a compromise, they were told no. Months passed. Legal bills grew. Carrying costs increased. Investors became nervous. Banks started asking uncomfortable questions. Then came the hearing that changed everything. Magnolia Ridge's attorneys argued that removing the fill completely would create additional environmental disturbance. Their experts claimed heavy excavation equipment could damage surrounding habitat. They insisted complete restoration wasn't practical. Their argument basically boiled down to this: fixing the problem would be difficult and expensive. I sat quietly listening while they explained all the reasons their own mistake should be allowed to remain partially in place. Then the judge leaned forward and asked a simple question: can the material be removed manually? The courtroom became very quiet. One consultant reluctantly admitted that technically it could. It would just take much longer and cost much more money. The judge nodded. Then remove it manually. Just like that, the entire strategy collapsed. I still remember looking across the room at Grant. The expression on his face was priceless. It was the look of a man realizing that the escape route he'd been counting on had just disappeared. Once the restoration order became official, reality arrived in a hurry. Because heavy machinery couldn't operate safely within large portions of the wetland, crews had to work using small-scale methods. Teams showed up with shovels, wheelbarrows, portable conveyor systems, and lightweight equipment designed to minimize environmental damage. If you had told me a year earlier that a multi-million-dollar development company would eventually be paying workers to remove mountains of dirt one load at a time, I probably would have laughed. Yet there they were. Day after day, week after week, month after month. The process moved painfully slowly. Workers scraped away thin layers of soil at a time. Environmental monitors observed every stage. Inspectors conducted regular reviews. Samples were constantly taken to verify compliance. There was no rushing, no shortcuts, no creative interpretations. Every requirement had to be satisfied exactly as ordered. Sometimes I would stand near the property line and watch. Not because I enjoyed seeing people work in miserable conditions, but because the entire situation felt surreal. The same company that had buried the wetland in a matter of days was now spending months undoing the damage. Rain delays complicated everything. Seasonal restrictions complicated everything. Unexpected drainage issues complicated everything. Costs climbed higher and higher. Every new report seemed to contain another unpleasant surprise. Then came the habitat restoration phase. Native vegetation had to be replanted. Hydrology had to be restored. Monitoring programs had to be established. Independent experts had to verify that recovery targets were being met. What started as a dirt removal project evolved into a long-term environmental restoration effort. The bills became staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars for excavation. Hundreds of thousands more for restoration work. Additional costs for monitoring, consultants, compliance reporting, legal fees, delays, and penalties. The numbers piled up so fast it became difficult to keep track. Meanwhile, the development itself sat frozen. Potential buyers disappeared. Investors lost confidence. Lending institutions grew increasingly nervous. According to people familiar with the situation, meetings became tense. Deadlines were missed. Revenue projections collapsed. The project that was supposed to generate profits became a financial anchor dragging everyone downward. Eventually, the penalties arrived. Regulatory fines were assessed. Civil damages were awarded. Legal costs accumulated. By then, the damage extended far beyond the original wetland. The company's reputation had suffered. Financing relationships had deteriorated. Future opportunities were evaporating. Then the final blow landed. The bank withdrew support. Without financing, Magnolia Ridge could no longer sustain the project. Construction stopped permanently. Assets were liquidated. The development property was eventually sold at a significant loss. I remember driving past the entrance months later. The fancy signs were gone. The marketing banners had disappeared. The dream of Cypress Landing had quietly faded away. Out in the southeast corner of my property, however, something remarkable was happening. Water had returned. Native plants were growing again. Birds had come back. Frogs filled the evening air with noise. Little by little, the wetland was becoming what it had always been before someone decided it was merely empty space waiting to be filled. Standing there one evening as the sun reflected across shallow water, I couldn't help thinking about how all of this started. One careless decision. One ignored boundary line. One assumption that money could erase consequences. In the end, the land remained. The wetland survived. And the people who thought they could bury both ended up buried under the weight of their own mistake. When people hear this story, the first thing they usually focus on is the money. They hear about the fines, the lawsuits, the restoration costs, the failed development, and they immediately start adding numbers in their heads. I get it. The financial damage was enormous. But honestly, that's not the part that stayed with me the most. What stayed with me was how quickly smart people convinced themselves they didn't need to respect something that had been there long before they arrived. That wetland wasn't hidden. It wasn't mysterious. It wasn't some secret patch of land nobody knew about. The maps existed. The records existed. The boundaries existed. The warnings existed. Every piece of information they needed was sitting right in front of them. Yet somewhere along the way, somebody decided deadlines mattered more than verification. Somebody decided assumptions were good enough. Somebody decided moving forward was easier than slowing down for 5 minutes and making sure they were right. And that's where everything started to fall apart. The older I get, the more I realize most disasters don't begin with evil intentions. They begin with arrogance. They begin when people become so confident in their own plans that they stop checking whether those plans match reality. That's true in construction. It's true in business. It's true in relationships. And honestly, it's true in life. This is a psychological trap that catches a lot of successful people. When you've won enough battles, you start believing you're incapable of losing one. When you've solved enough problems with money, you start believing money is the answer to every problem. Eventually, you stop asking whether you should do something and start assuming you can. That's a dangerous mindset. Grant and his company weren't dealing with a math problem. They were dealing with property rights, environmental law, and a piece of land that didn't belong to them. Those things don't disappear just because a project schedule says they should. According to standard procedure, regulations exist precisely because somebody before us already made the mistake we're thinking about making today. Most rules are written in response to somebody else's disaster. People love complaining about regulations until they become the person needing protection from someone else's bad decision. Then suddenly those same regulations start making a lot of sense. From a legal perspective, one of the biggest lessons here is that fixing a mistake early is almost always cheaper than fighting reality. If Magnolia Ridge had stopped work immediately, admitted the error, and restored the wetland before regulators became involved, the outcome probably would have looked very different. It still would have been expensive. It still would have hurt. But it wouldn't have spiraled into years of legal battles, mounting fines, lost financing, and public embarrassment. Pride is expensive. Delays are expensive. Denial is expensive. Reality eventually sends the bill. Another thing this experience taught me is that ordinary people often have more power than they realize. A lot of folks assume large companies automatically win because they have bigger budgets and bigger legal teams. Sometimes they do. But facts matter. Documentation matters. Persistence matters. The reason this situation turned around wasn't because I had more money than the developer. Trust me, I didn't. It turned around because I had evidence, patience, and the willingness to follow the proper channels instead of giving up when things became inconvenient. The lesson here is that protecting your rights often starts with something as simple as paying attention. Know your property. Keep records. Understand the rules that affect your land. Ask questions when something feels wrong. Most importantly, don't assume somebody else will protect your interests for you. Sometimes you have to be the person who speaks up. Looking back now, the wetland is thriving again. The water returns after storms exactly the way it always did. The birds are back. The vegetation is healthy. Nature, given enough time, has an incredible ability to recover. That's probably my favorite part of the entire story. Not the courtroom victories. Not the financial penalties. Not the headlines. The fact that the land itself survived. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have accepted the money and sold the corner of the property? Or would you have fought to restore it exactly the way I did? Let me know down in the comments because I've heard strong arguments on both sides, And honestly, that's what makes stories like this interesting. Sometimes the biggest debate isn't what happened. It's whether you would have made the same choice when it happened to you.